Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Abigail Brown. I am a manager on the Codes and Standards team here at NEEP, and this is NEEP's January Ready, Set, Scale webinar, Modern Rate Design, Affordability, Efficiency, and Electrification. Today's webinar will dive into NEEP's work on electricity rates with a discussion from industry experts on the merits and drawbacks of various approaches. This webinar is being recorded in NEEP's ongoing effort to improve accessibility to both our work and events. We have enabled closed captioning. The control to disable this feature is in the lower right corner. This session will be recorded and posted online for viewing. All lines will remain on mute. Please type any questions you have in the Q&A box at any time, and the chat is also available for comments, discussion, and collaboration. NEEP is a nonprofit 501(c)(3) founded in 1996, so it is our 30th birthday this year. We envision the region's homes, buildings, businesses, and communities transformed into efficient, affordable, low-carbon, resilient places to live, work, and play. We drive regional collaboration and best practices in energy efficiency so the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region can lower energy bills, reduce air and carbon pollution, create jobs, and improve energy and climate resilience. And our approach is to drive market transformation regionally by fostering collaboration and innovation, developing research and tools, and disseminating knowledge. Next, I'd like to thank our state partners, allies, and funders for their support. We could not do this work without them. We have our allies here and our funders. So today I'll start us off with a high-level overview of our recent paper on modernizing rates to prepare us for the conversation we'll have. And then my colleague Luke Miller will lead a discussion among our panelists for the majority of the hour. So let's dive in. I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this paper, Erin Cosgrove and Luke Miller. So why look at rates now? The landscape of the grid and how people interact with the grid is changing. Energy and grid costs are rising, creating issues of affordability. As you can see from the map, this is a particularly salient issue in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. Additionally, electrification is changing how we use the grid. Technology is evolving to enable flexible load with the growth of demand-responsive and grid interactive technology. Also, more customers are engaging in electric rates, which is spurred by net energy metering and EV rates. The standard two-part tariff has not evolved to meet these challenges, so we must look for further solutions. The first section of the paper presents a primer on rate design, which starts with a summary of key principles of rate design. I don't have time to dive into the details of all of these key principles, but I did want to acknowledge that there exists this set of principles by which all rates are created. On the left are the traditional Baumbright principles of fairness, economic efficiency, practicality, rate and bill stability, and clarity. On the right are the modern principles developed by RAP, RMI, and ACEEE that emphasize preciseness, social equity, simplicity, utility revenue stability, and encouraging energy efficiency. Before we get into more detailed rate structures, I'll explain the basic components we see in many common rates across the United States. First, fixed charges are flat fees included in each billing period that cover utility fixed costs. Note that there is a significant disagreement around which elements of utility operations should be included in a fixed charge. Next, volumetric charges are charges based on total customer usage during a billing period, measured in dollars per kilowatt hour, and often split into transmission, distribution, and supply. Together, fixed and volumetric charges comprise the standard two-part tariff. Next, demand charges are optional charges that bill customers for their demand, kilowatt usage, for a certain time period instead of total kilowatt hours consumed. Finally, policy charges are also optional and they typically provide funding assistance for certain programs, such as energy efficiency programs or low-income assistance programs. Section 2 of the paper dives into what we mean by modernizing rates. A fixed charge can be increased, decreased, or become an income-adjusted fixed charge. The best example of an income-adjusted fixed charge is currently in California. Volumetric charges can be changed temporally or based on kilowatt hours used over a set period. Temporal variation includes seasonal rates, time of use rates, and real-time pricing. Alternatively, block rates change the volumetric charge based on how many kilowatt hours are used over a billing period. These rate structures can be used in tandem. For example, you could have a seasonal time of use rate. Finally, utilities could use a demand charge. However, these are less common in the United States. This slide shows the possible additional measures that can be applied on top of the rate structures. First, there are rebates and event-based pricing, which change the price of electricity during peak or off-peak times to incentivize load shifting when it is most important. Second, we identified different technology groups that could be targeted by rates and rebates to reflect new usage patterns of efficient electric technology. Finally, low-income programs can be layered on top of other rate programs to lower energy burden and address affordability. Section 3 of the paper identifies trends in the rate-making landscape of the Northeast. The first trend is the high adoption of rates for EVs to manage grid peak demand. There are 19 different EV rates, 9 EV off-peak rebate programs, and 3 EV peak time rebate programs throughout the region. Next, many states and utilities have low-income rates or rate-adjacent programs using the various formats shown on the previous slide. Additionally, we see that opt-in TOU rates have low customer adoption throughout the region. The table on the right-hand side of the slide shows which state entities and utilities offer different types of rates and programs by state. And we have a few different iterations of tables like this throughout the paper. So if you're interested in this information, it can be found in the appendix. We also acknowledge considerations for implementation within the landscape of the Northeast. The majority of Northeastern states are restructured, as shown on the map, which increases barriers to aligning rates among providers and encouraging rate adoption. The Northeast has low but steadily rising adoption of advanced metering infrastructure, which can limit which types of rates are available to put in place today. The Northeast has a high level of delivered fuel customers, which can change some of the economic calculations of switching to heat pumps in comparison to other regions. As heat pump adoption increases, the winter peak is forecasted to increase as well. And finally, there is a growth of data centers, which is particularly occurring in the PJM region. In section 4 of the paper, we categorize the types of modern rates based on how they impact 4 different policy goals. Rates can be used to encourage energy efficiency, accommodate the use of efficient electric technology, minimize grid costs at times of high system usage with demand flexibility, and focus on affordability and equity. It can be challenging to think of how to pursue multiple of these objectives simultaneously because the policies don't always align with one another. So we provided spectrums for regulators, utilities, and advocates to consider when designing rates. The graphic on this slide shows the spectrum for how rates can signal to customers to use energy efficiently or not. The other 3 tables are included in the paper. The final section of the paper details 4 key topics of consideration that we think are crucial to implementing these new rates successfully. First, we have considerations for low-income customers, including how to identify and inform customers to limit potential harm. Next, we recommend establishing goals, assessing the technology landscape, and engaging key stakeholders. Third, there are important regulatory and implementation considerations for new rates. And lastly, we discuss customer engagement and implementation strategies to ensure customers are ready to use the new rate and the intended goals of the rate are achieved. With that, I'll pass it over to Luke to start our discussion.
Thank you, Abby. All right. I think that's a great way to get us started and prepare everyone here for the rousing discussion we're about to have with our panelists. I'll invite you all, three of you, to come on camera. Mark, Elizabeth, Mohit. Um, Thank you for joining us today. We're so glad to have a great panel of speakers here to keep the discussion on rate design going, and get into some of the details that Abby has kind of brought up. So starting off, we'll do some quick introductions here. Can you please all give us just a quick 1-2 minute description of your background, your organization, and your work on rate design in the past, and principles that you follow with rate design? Elizabeth, we'll start with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Hunter. I'm a rate analyst for Con Ed in New York City. I work in the rate strategy division, which is part of rate engineering. I have been working for Con Ed for about 5 years. Before that, I worked for the Massachusetts DPU in the Rates and Revenue Requirements division. So shout out to anyone from Massachusetts. In my current role, I do a lot of work analyzing rate designs, running bill impacts, and also just addressing rate design concerns and rate cases. Con Ed has a lot of rate structures available to its customers. Just as an example, we have 5 rate designs for residential customers. So I bring a lovely perspective on that.
All right, thank you. Mark?
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark LaBelle. I've been with the RAP for almost exactly 7 years now. I live just south of Boston. Before I joined RAP, at my past jobs, I participated in a number of different rate cases in the Northeast US. At RAP, I have a more national role. RAP is a global nonprofit that works on cutting edge regulatory issues. Most notably, in my past, we did a report for the Michigan Public Service Commission on the future of rate design a few years ago that I think can be dropped in the chat here. The question I'd flag for everyone today is, in the modern era, we can really move forward quite quickly with better data billing systems on improved efficiency of pricing structures. But the key question is, how do we not um, uh, take a huge step backwards on other key regulatory and rate making criteria like revenue recovery, fair cost allocation, and customer understanding. So coming to that balance, working with all stakeholders, utilities, and regulators is the type of thing that RAP does on a regular basis.
All right, thank you, Mark. And last but not least, Mohit.
Good morning. I'm Mohit Chhabra. I work with the Natural Resources Defense Council as a senior analyst. Some of my work on rates and related issues includes implementation of the income graduated fixed charges in California, net metering updates, avoided costs and such. Can't take credit for developing all of those ideas, but can take some credit for helping put them into action and doing some analysis on them. Regarding rates, whenever I think about it, I do think it's important to start with the fundamentals, which is that the only guidance economics provides on setting rates is that for efficiency, rates should be at the marginal cost to provide service. That leads to a practical problem. Utility spends a lot of money on fixed costs, policy, and how do they collect that? So to collect that, there are different options: volumetric rates, demand charges, fixed charges, and each of them come with their trade-offs. And we need to evaluate those trade-offs with an open mind, relevant to each jurisdiction, and look at 4 key questions. How do these choices impact policy outcomes like efficiency, energy efficiency, fairness, and so on? How does the price of electricity compare with competing fuels once you're all said and done? gasoline, natural gas, etc.? And how much of a loss do you take on economic efficiency when you make these trade-offs? And finally, um, fairness, customer understanding. Are the bills progressive? Do customers understand what to do with it? My bias is to have simpler, fewer rate structures across a region and have specific incentives for the things you want to encourage. Thank you.
You're teeing us up perfectly to get into this discussion. This is going to be really good. I have a couple questions prepared, but I do want to highlight that we will take a couple audience questions in the Q&A feature down below here. You can ask your questions, and other participants can upvote them or give them a +1. So if anyone sees a question they support, give it a thumbs up, and we will keep track. All right, so I'll jump into our first question that we have here. The first one's on technology-specific rates. Lately, technology-specific rates have become more popular. We've seen them for electric vehicles and also for heat pumps. These rates seek to align electric rates with grid costs and new energy usage patterns. In your work, for all of you, what role do these types of technology-specific rates have, and what technologies should they apply to? And do we think that they're a long or a short-term solution? I'll start this one with you, Mark.
Sure. Thanks, Luke, and I should have thanked NEEP for having me today. Really appreciate it and all your good work. So look, my feeling on technology-specific rates is that they should be timely, targeted, and temporary. That this is a short-term measure, and that there's really this spiraling complexity problem when we keep having different kinds of technology-specific rates for different applications as it comes up every 2, 3, or 5 years. So, it's not the end of the world to have a special rate for customers, but you want to be careful about how you manage the overall system. So, coming up, one of my favorite ideas is to have two separate technology neutral residential customer classes. And you can start to use that distinction to manage cost allocation questions and target different customer groups for more specific, more complex, and economically accurate rates. So look, there's a lot of different tools you can use, but I do prefer technology neutral to technology specific. That said, compromises for the real world, a few technology specific rates are not going to break everything.
Awesome. Thank you. Next, I'll go over to you, Mohit.
I agree with Mark that they are a good short-term solution to get things started. As I said, my bias is to have rates that generally work for most things we want and have narrow incentives for special things you want to encourage. When we talk about technology-specific rates, I think it's really important to draw the distinction that when we say technology-specific rates, they aren't for only one technology. They're generally for the whole home for adopters of a certain technology. And when you provide whole home rates for the adopter of a certain technology, you also provide them a whole host of incentives for doing other things that aren't related to the technology. And I don't think there is good research on the behavior they induce for all other things. For example, if I'm an EV owner, I could charge my EV at my free workplace charging and change my usage pattern to most benefit. And that would impact other customers, their fairness and equity implications. And more importantly, this doesn't always scale up to all customers and getting utilities revenue requirement whole. I do think we need to think a little bit more about this, and we need to have more robust solutions to encouraging technologies via rates before we tie ourselves in a knot, wherein we have a lot of customers on a technology-specific rates for whole home rates, and we find out that those aren't extrapolatable to everybody, and now we need to make a sudden change, and we're in a bind. Thank you.
Thank you. That's helpful context. And Elizabeth?
I think both of them said, had good responses. I am allowed to say that the company does not support technology-specific rates, and there's a good reason for that. They're simply just too hard to implement. They don't take into consideration the varieties of ways that people use their technology, such as combining them. And once they're implemented, they're extremely hard to change. Like even a time of use period, it's extremely hard to change, even if it doesn't make sense for your system. So just generally speaking, the goal should always be to align your rates with the grid costs for all customers. We don't want to be intentionally or unintentionally incentivizing or disincentivizing anything. We have the issue right now with heat pumps. We shouldn't be unintentionally disincentivizing them. We do have rates at Con Ed that benefit EV customers. We do have rates that benefit heat pump customers, but we really strive to ensure that they're all revenue neutral. They do not gatekeep based off of technology. Anyone can be on them. And we also think that there is room for these like short-term rates to overcome short-term hurdles. So we do have like an EV phase-in rate, which is for non-residential customers to overcome some gaps of scale. And then we also have Smart Charge New York, which is very explicitly an incentive program that's done outside of rates, so it can easily be removed. But yes, generally not a fan. Do not like those technology specific rates.
All right, thank you. You set me up nicely for our next question here, talking about the rate that Con Ed has that can benefit heat pump users. We're going to talk about demand charges now. There's been some research that has found that demand charges can lower operational costs for heat pump users, like you said, Elizabeth. But it's often difficult to get residential customers to adopt these because they're seen as pretty complicated or hard to understand. Elizabeth, can you talk a little more about the demand-based rate that benefits heat pump users and explain a little about how this demand charge works and the benefits it can offer?
Sure. And I will also say that, we have 5 residential rates and it's hard to get customers on any of them, not just our demand-based rate. But yeah, so for anyone who's unaware, the cost of providing distribution service is basically more based off of your maximum usage than your total volumetric usage. So because of this, the company considers demand charges to be the most cost-reflective way of charging our customers. But our residential default rate is still volumetric. It also happens to be the case that heat pump customers are natural winners on these rates. They have a lot of usage, but a pretty good load factor. So their average to maximum usage is pretty close together. And as a result, they do well on the rates. So the rate that we have been trying to get all of our residential heat pump customers are on is a time of use maximum monthly demand charge. It's known as the SPP rate. In our tariff, it is SC1 rate 4. I think we might be changing the name of it soon to the steady use rate. And there are several ways this rate helps our heat pump customers. First off, it is demand-based. So as I mentioned, they just tend to do better on these rates. It's also a time of use rate on both the distribution and the supply side. So that means that heat pump customers who tend to use during off-peak hours, generally, they tend to be able to take advantage of that. And then finally, the customer charge, it's set at full customer cost, which is above the customer charge for our standard rate. So that's particularly beneficial for our large users, and heat pump customers tend to be large users.
Perfect. Thank you for that background. Mark and Mohit, now, can you talk about how demand charges have come up in your work, and whether you see them as potential solutions to alleviate additional costs for heat pump users that sometimes come up under traditional volumetric rates? I'll let you go first, Mark.
Sure. So I think RAP historically has been very skeptical of demand charges. But my attitude is that there's a place for everything and everything in its place, right? When the Northeastern states restructured a generation ago, generation capacity demand charges went away, right? We have new supply structures, new market structures. And we got rid of demand charges as being a little bit anachronistic in that context. So when we come down to the distribution level, there's a different set of questions. I think there's a bigger role for demand charges for C&I customers. For residential customers, these are more complex and gradualism is absolutely appropriate. Low-income customers in particularly, we should be wary of putting them on more complex rates they don't understand, can get surprise bills. Now, for traditional demand charges, there could be a good cost causation metric or linkage to the most local grid infrastructure. New York's been actually looking at some of these questions over the last few years, but most specifically, the service line that connects single homes to the grid, line transformers, those type of costs, there's a much clearer linkage between an individual customer's individual non-coincident peak and the size of that specific infrastructure segment. So we went into these questions in great detail in a publication 5 years ago now. This was actually my COVID year project. So we can drop it in the chat in a little bit. But I think you have to have a good deal of sensitivity and nuance around these questions.
Thank you. Now to you, Mohit.
Thank you. The sign of good friends is they can agree and disagree at the same time. So I have a slightly different point of view here. I think that a lot of what you build to handle customer load, and once you build it, those are fixed and sunk costs. And how you collect it is then a policy decision. You aren't forced to collect it on the base of demand or something else. I think this policy decision, again, has to be made in the context of what do you gain and lose with respect to fairness, efficiency, and policy objectives. So that's one. Second is traditional demand charges, which you charge you on the basis of your highest 15-minute usage period. They generally charge you more when your demand, if you change your consumption such that your peak demand goes up. And that can happen a lot of times for customers that are off EVs and heat pumps. So in many cases, they wouldn't. You could, however, be creative like Con Ed has and have more complicated demand charges that can achieve those ends. But then at that rate, you've sort of developed a fixed charge that looks like a demand charge with that complexity. Customers that have a flat load shape would also do well with very high peak and off-peak volumetric charges and would also do well under other rate structures. So I'd be keen to also understand the relative comparison of other rate designs, including a higher fixed charge, income graduate fixed charge, and others, along with a demand charge, as opposed to demand charge or a creative demand charge versus the status quo. I also think that a special shout out is necessary for Con Ed's Smart Charge program, which is a really smart way for incentivizing EVs, only EVs outside of rate design. So customers get money back when they charge their EVs in a manner that's grid beneficial. And I think more utilities should be looking at that.
All right. Thanks so much. Elizabeth, if you want to respond to any of that, I'll give you a second, but.
Oh, sure. I only noted two things. There's probably more I should have noted. The first one I wanted to point out was there's been a lot of discussion about low-income customers and their performance on demand-based rates. And, there's always this thing about there's not enough studies and stuff like that, which is fair to a degree. But we did do a huge study of, almost 100,000 residential customers. And of that, there were low-income customers in it. And, the number one predictor is load factor. And low-income customers actually have a pretty good load factor because they don't have a ton of appliances. They may be home most of the day. And it turned out it did not hurt them that much. That much was probably the wrong word to say. They actually performed relatively well on it. And there's also bill protections embedded in the demand charge because it is less, it doesn't fluctuate as much as a volumetric charge. So I do want, I think that there's hopefully going to be a growing amount of evidence just, to be like, don't worry, like low income customers might not be as hurt by these rates as we think they will be. And then Mohit also talked about just the fairness of of demand rates over fixed charges. And, I think that there's clearly a role for fixed charges. I'm not against fixed charges, but I think that there's a fairness component to that too. Sorry, I don't know why my nose is disgusting. But when you think about it, especially if you have a very diverse service territory like Con Ed does, if you are a small customer and you have a small demand, is it really fair that you should be charged a higher fixed rate just because there's a McMansion over here that has a really high demand? I think that there's actually demand is a relatively more fair than a fixed charge there. I'm not sure if there's any other topics that were mentioned that I also should respond to.
No, that's
unless
perfect.
Mimicking. I also like Smart Charge New York. It's great.
And thanks, Luke. Can I say a sentence, please?
Of course.
So my point simply is that there are different ways of collecting these fixed charges, and depending on context, utility territory, and customer demographics, what's fair, what your definition of fair, and what outcomes are received will change. As an example, on the West Coast, a lot of wealthy people live in coastal areas in apartments, sometimes in San Francisco. And if you go by demand charge would lead to fair outcomes for collecting non-marginal costs, these customers would be charged a lot less than customers living in the interior parts of the state that have a lot of cooling need. The point simply is do the analysis to figure out what leads to fair outcomes and go with that. And that is very contextual.
Perfect. Thank you. With that, we can get into our next question that, incidentally, we talk a little about California here too. We want to mention that states have started to examine ways to create rates that are more friendly to users who adopt electrification technologies. We've seen this in California, seen it in Massachusetts. These rates look to lower volumetric charges so that customers with higher usage have lower bill impacts from this increased volumetric usage. It's a bit controversial to do this and then to increase fixed charges in tandem, as it can kind of weaken the energy efficiency price signal and potentially change the energy burden for low and moderate income households. Should states be looking at an increased fixed charge in order to encourage electrification? And how could a state implement this in an equitable and affordable way? And I'll start with you, Mohit.
So some context behind California's income graduate fixed charges is that California has a lot of policy costs built into electric rates. And in the counterfactual, where non-electricity related policy costs are collected through the tax base, electric rates would be lower, things would be collected differently. And income graduate fixed charges are a rough, crude proxy for that, given that these costs can't be taken out anymore. So that's some important context. I do think that fixed charges can help. Income graduating them can make them fairer. The question again is, what is the right volumetric signal for encouraging the right amount of energy efficiency and electrification? In California, average electric rates are around 40 cents a kilowatt hour. I'll let that sink in a little bit, 40. And when you're talking about reducing volumetric rates from 40 to 35 or 30 cents a kilowatt hour, you still have more than enough signal for conservation energy efficiency. Finally, what is the right signal for energy efficiency? From an all customer utility context, it's the marginal cost. Whenever you do cost effectiveness for energy efficiency, you look at avoided costs of the system, right? And that's how much cost all customers avoid. Being good environmentalists, we like to look at the social marginal cost, account for pollution and carbon, and that's not as straightforward. So here are a few things to think about when you think through income graduate fixed charges. Again, is you got to look at the jurisdiction where you want to make a change, see how efficient or inefficient their volumetric charges are, see what the impact on customers and fairness would be of a fixed charge, and see whether some forms of graduation can make things fairer and more palatable politically. I'll also let you in on another secret. It's a lot easier to make controversial changes in states like California when you live in New York.
Thank you, Mohit. That's that's a good one to note. I'll go over to you next, Mark.
Thanks. So Mohit and I have had long conversations about these issues every year or two, and I think we could actually flip spots and make each other's speeches. So I'm going to flag one area of disagreement between the two of us. Um, Starting with the area of agreement, it's very much important to get a better handle on marginal costs in individual jurisdictions. How you do that has very important implications, and you get down to very detailed disputes between experts on how you measure these costs. I am very much more of a believer in long-term marginal costs for certain parts of the system compared to Mohit and some of his colleagues. We don't need to go all the way into those weeds today. Very specifically, California leaves out certain marginal transmission costs, in my view, when they're doing the analysis for the California Public Utilities Commission. Again, these things make a few cents of difference, but Mohit and I generally agree on the importance of marginal costs, I think. So, I think the specific form of tiered customer charges is interesting. Um, you know, there are demand-based subscription rates that look like fixed charges. In Burbank, California, there are tiered customer charges based on the size of the residential customer, certain characteristics. Um, actually, it's funny. In New York, backed its way into tiered customer charges long before California implemented their income graduated customer charge because of the way the low income program works in New York, combined with a slightly higher base residential customer charge. The policies in California and New York are now more similar than you would think based on the national discussion. So, just a few points of difference there. I think it's fine for states to explore tiered customer charges. The size and exact structure is going to be a debate.
Thank you. All right, and now to you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, just in general, I think like bill protections are very important. I am not against them in any shape or form, but I do think they need to be done outside of rate design. And fixed charges should recover fixed costs. I don't think we should be doing it to promote anything else other than cost causation. And yeah, for New York State, we have one way of doing it, which is that we do offer a monthly fixed charge. That's essentially does away with the customer charge. We don't fiddle around with the volumetric charges or the demand charges, but it does help some customers. There are problems with it, but it helps. It's one way of doing it.
All right, thank you. Next, we'll go into some changes to the default rate structures that states apply. To better reflect grid costs, states have considered or are continuing to consider implementing default time of use rates. California has done this and it's been in place for years. Maine is currently considering it at the PUC level. These time of use rates can be a major change for ratepayers if not implemented with pretty significant educational campaigns and bill protections. For states that are considering this or looking into default time of use rates, what would some key considerations be in implementing them, both for the design of the rate and also for bill protections offered to customers? Mark, can we start with you this time?
Sure. I think it's important to start to move customers to default TOU as soon as billing systems in the Northeast AMI installation can handle it. Um, there are additional complexities in restructured jurisdictions to how you set this up because of the way supply procurement is done. You have to change the way that the utilities procure basic service. Do you let customers opt out into competitive suppliers and all sorts of other fun wrinkles that aren't quite the same in other parts of the country. Michigan also has default time of use rates now, Colorado. So Missouri has the teeniest, tiniest default time of use rate you can imagine. So, I think we're definitely headed in that direction. I would also strongly encourage moving towards default peak time rebates and critical peak pricing or other forms of this for all customers. Um, Now, how do you build customer protection on top of this is a great question. As I mentioned before, I'm happy to have two separate residential rate classes and keep low income and low usage customers on less sophisticated rates. I actually like 3-period default time of use rates, where you keep the middle level around the level of current rates. That gives you revenue stability, and that protects a certain amount against major bill impacts to customers who keep their same load profile, give or take. So, there's a lot of different things you can try to try to manage the transition. But I do think we really need to start going not only to default time of use rates, but peak time rebates, critical peak pricing. Demand response initiatives also are important to build in at the same time. So.
Awesome. Thank you. Elizabeth?
Yeah. So I've thought of a few things on this one. First of all, it's just being very clear what is this motivation for doing it at the state level? Like, is this a supply or a distribution rate concern? Especially in the Northeast, where the utilities are mostly distribution only. So, you need to figure out what to do on the competitive supply end if it's a supply issue you're trying to deal with. And then again, just going off of my personal experience on all this, what do you do with territories that have a relatively flat load curve? Arbitrarily defining the peak periods or making it a requirement on a state level, like that could raise costs for everyone. And I'm sure that's not what anyone's trying to do. But you do need to take into consideration if you're doing this on the state level and you're making requirements for it, like, different jurisdictions have different requirements. So it may not be necessarily the right solution. And then another issue that has come up with time of use rates is, how do you do net metering? There are so many ways of doing it. And a lot of times what ends up happening is you do end up increasing that subsidy to the solar customers. So, making sure you take that into consideration when you develop them. But, those are just the few first things that I think of with that question.
All right. Thank you. And I'll go to you, Mohit.
I'll start with where I started with is that volumetric rates should approximate marginal costs. And if marginal costs show variation, so should volumetric rates, at least for economic efficiency purposes, right? The other thing I'll note is that you can't have everything. You can't have a dynamic price signal to minimize grid costs and make sure bills don't change for most people or a subset of people. If you are advocating for some sort of time of use rate to reflect grid conditions, that's different from how you charge things today. You should understand that you're also advocating for changing who pays how much for what they do and use. So there's a tension there. If you want to maximize savings from efficiency through time of use, then some people will pay more and some people will pay less, right? You can't have everything. Secondly, I think we need to trust people a little bit more, give them the right information, educate them. And I do think most people can adjust their behavior to varying extents. Finally, and maybe we'll talk about this more, customer response and keeping rate design straightforward is so important. A lot of our work in advocacy hinges on the rationale that when we give customers the right signals, they'll change their behavior and we'll get better outcomes. But if the signal is so complex that it's garbled, customers won't be able to understand and respond.
All right. Thank you. Next up, we're going to get into a topic that has come up alongside rate design a lot throughout the past year and maybe, well, certainly a lot longer than that, but especially in the last year. Increasing energy costs are a huge factor across much of our region and across the US. Um, Many factors are leading to these increased costs, but data centers and the increased load that data centers are poised to bring comes up a lot. How do you all see the continued growth of data centers impacting residential rates down the line? And are there any strategies that regulators can use to lower the impacts of data centers on residential customers? I'll start with you, Mohit.
So I think there's a lot unknown here with respect to data centers, and there's some things that we know. What we do know is that the expectation of data centers in specific regions with capacity constraints has pushed up capacity prices like PJM states. What we don't know in every instance is what the tariffs for the data centers would be and how much would the data centers pay on a monthly basis. What we do know is that when large new loads come in, there is sometimes a supply shortage and energy prices can rise in every hour. What we also know is that that would lead to more supply coming online and prices reducing for everybody. But exactly how this plays out in different jurisdictions is dependent on the situation in that jurisdiction and the decision that regulators make. So regulators have some important decisions like at a high level, cost allocation amongst different customer classes. If you do careful cost allocation, you can protect residential customers from most of these price swings. Not all, most. And second is, how do you design the specifics of the tariffs for data centers so that they pay their fair share? This would include some upfront fees, some exit fees to make sure that if they go out of business, you aren't left with dead-end costs. And this would also require some creative thinking on how to allocate restricted supply of grid resources, generation amongst a lot of data centers. And how do we separate out what's real versus what's speculative? So there is potential for cost to increase. In some cases, there's also potential for cost to decrease if you do cost allocation correctly. But a lot of that hinges on what actually happens and the individual decisions that regulators make for these.
Mark, you can jump in next.
Sure. I I would flag that there's a lot of funny questions that are coming up about federal and state jurisdiction over different questions. And, how does PJM do transmission cost allocation? How do the retail states do transmission cost allocation? That is very much not clear to me that everything is lined up or thought through, or that any one person knows what the current status of all those policies are even in one given state, right? Pick Pennsylvania, right? Like I have not seen somebody explain clearly what what the exact mix of policies is that's happening, right? And this comes up because in distribution tariffs, when you have a new customer, there's a line extension policy. There's a calculation that all utilities do that if it's an expensive line connection, um, customers are required to pay a contribution in native construction. And this is sort of a typical thing that all retail utilities do. Exactly what's happening at the ISO level for that seems to be a total mystery. Folks like the Union of Concerned Scientists have looked at this in some detail, totaling up all the costs in PJM that are being peanut buttered to all customers across the region for these interconnections. And it's genuinely not clear what formulas are being applied, what regulatory rules are being applied to figure out who pays what. And, I think there's just some very basic questions that um, it's going to be really hard to coordinate these federal and state jurisdictional issues at the same time. So it's a little bit of a mess, and I think there's still a major question about what the current policy is, and then how do you get everybody on the same page to have a consistent set of answers that are fair and relatively efficient.
Thanks, Mark. And I'll go to you now, Elizabeth.
Yeah, this is a complex issue. This is not something that I'm particularly well versed in, but I know this New York is dealing with this at the state level, and they're particularly concerned about how to protect ratepayers. And of course, within the company, there's a whole group of people working on this issue. So, there are issues such as the kayak, which was mentioned, as well as possibility of a separate rate class. But yeah, I don't have too much to say on this.
All right, thank you.
Is it SEAC or kayak? I actually never know.
Oh, I've heard it both ways.
Yeah.
I've always heard it kayak, but maybe I just like kayaking. Yeah, no.
Too many acronyms out there. It's a tough world we live in. Our probably last question here, unless we get any Q&A from our audience here, focuses on smart appliances and demand response. We wanted to bring up this as it's also coming up a lot in conversations lately. Virtual power plants and demand flexibility are sometimes proposed as solutions to lowering peak demand, alleviating the need for more grid infrastructure build out as load continues to grow. As technology evolves, like smart thermostats and heat pump water heaters, to be more responsive to grid events and signals, the burdens on customers can be lessened to respond themselves. What role does rate design have in enhancing grid flexibility and lowering peak demand? And for states that are looking to implement rates to encourage demand flexibility, what are some key considerations that you would highlight? And I'll start with you on this one, Elizabeth.
I think the, obvious answer would just be time of use rates, demand or otherwise. I think they're just good for removing the cross subsidization, encouraging customers to shift load, and just generally bringing about customer awareness that, you need to stagger your load and also use during off-peak times. That's all I have to say.
Could you mention maybe some of the utility, like administrative and implementation considerations that would go into these type of demand response rates?
Well, for demand response rates, which I do feel like is like a little bit different than, just a standard rate design. I mean, just making sure that you have good communication with your customers so that they're like aware that, they need to reduce their demand or not. At least that's how I understand demand responses. It's not your basic everyday rate design. It's your responding to real-time events. And when that is the case, you need to make sure that, they get text messages from the company saying, hey, could you reduce your demand at the moment?
All right, thank you. Mark, you can go next.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the only thing I'd flag is it's great to have individual technology demand response programs, but shifting to, peak time rebates, critical peak pricing is a whole house demand response signal, right? So getting more to the technology neutral, customers who have storage can operate all of their usages around that signal, right? Coming up with those broader signals and less like this one technology, we have a special meter on it that we're sending a signal to, right? Is one long-term goal.
Thank you. Yeah, Mohit.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's not that I think I agree, I know that I agree. The price at a certain time is the price of electricity. And if you can avoid that via solar storage or energy efficiency, you still benefit everyone in the same way. So we gotta have accurate price signals. That's the foundation for advanced demand response. This reminds me of a paper that came out a year and a half ago where a lot of economists read about efficiency losses when you go away from dynamic real-time pricing. But what these researchers found was that you can get to most of those benefits via cost-reflective time of use rates plus critical peak pricing without a lot of the implementation challenges. And that's, I think, a very useful finding because for a change, that's a lot of academic economists proposing something very practical. So we should take that to heart. And it's very robust research. Finally, I'll say that keep in mind that we need to stay flexible with what the costs imposed by usage are, what their use case for demand response is. And I was reminded of this fact by your last question, because as data centers come online, they will materially change the supply mix, the mix of energy prices in different hours, and the need on different hours. So stay open to that.
All right. Thank you. Go
What
ahead, Mark. Yeah.
one wrinkle I forgot to mention that's important in restructured states, the way you do supply procurement it actually turns out to be quite important. If you use average load profiles for customers, there's no incentive for retail suppliers, whether the basic service or a competitive supplier, to manage anything about that customer's load, right? Because they're charged the same average load profile no matter what. And this was a practical thing that was done to implement restructuring a long time ago. But as we have AMI, you can change how that works. And if you actually want to build in incentives for suppliers to help manage the grid, going to load settle like advanced better load settlement practices is like one of those like deep background regulatory things you can do that most customers won't even notice, but sort of shifts how the whole system works. So, there's lots of interesting wrinkles. It doesn't have to just be customer facing prices that give you all of the response.
All right. Thank you all. As we wrap up here, I'm going to give everyone like 30 seconds if we have any final takeaways or thoughts that you want to share very briefly. Mohit, you can go first.
I think I've said most of what I wanted to say. Thank you, NEEP, for giving us the opportunity. I'd stress on staying flexible. Remember that the only thing that economics says is for efficiency, you should reflect marginal costs. I will also say that there's a lot of creativity out there to be applied on how to design rates that sticks with the principles of economics, leads to good policy outcomes. And one thing I notice is that in our industry, we often mistake precedent for hard and fast rules, and that's not always the case. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to you, Elizabeth.
Sure. So I think one thing I would like to say is that, we've had rates for like the past 100 years, and we have tried a lot of things. And I think there's a lot of lessons in history that we can take, in terms of what has worked and what has not worked. And especially with implementation, that when we're thinking about rate designs going forward, we need to, consider.
Thank you. All right. And take us home, Mark.
Well, it's funny. I'll just build off Elizabeth's point that um, doing research for what the paper I shared earlier on demand charges, there actually was a discussion over 100 years ago, nearly at the beginning of the electric industry, about time of use rates, demand charges, like for all customers, like all these things were tried. You could accomplish a lot of things with some analog metering systems back in the day. So these debates have been around since literally the 19th century. So I'm sure they're going to be debated for the next 100 years too.
And we can have more great panel discussions to keep working through them. All right. Thank you all to all three of our panelists, Mark, Elizabeth, Mohit. We're so glad to have you joining us. I'm sure that our whole audience found this really helpful. I certainly did. Um, as we wrap up, we've got just a couple last real quick things to share on slides. We have our paper highlighted here, Modern Rate Design in the Northeast, Unlocking Efficiency, Affordability, and Electrification. We published this in mid-December, but if you haven't given it a read yet, you still have time. It's up on our site, and we'll share the link later. And going forward, I believe we have one more slide. We've got events coming up. Our next event will be our annual summit. It's going to be in Baltimore this year, June 2nd to 4th. I know a lot of y'all have been in the past, so come show up again. And then next, we've got our heating electrification workshop in Portland, Maine, October 20th to 22nd. So we would be thrilled to see as many of you as possible there at both of these. Um, with that, thanks again to all of our panelists. Really glad to have you here. And thanks to the audience for coming out.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good one, y'all.